anyway. And then to close the remaining 16% margin gap, he assumed in the model that NHS would agree to future price increases to maintain CSC's profit margin. And by the letter of the contract, there was no reason to believe that NHS would agree to such terms, and the prices that he was using were ridiculously high just to meet the 16%. This is an obvious violation of GAAP, so there's no factual support of any kind to assume the price increase, and this is all just an artificial way to pad the numbers for him. So if in a couple of reports I found, there was plenty of former executives that would say there was a lot of revenue to be reduced in this contract that would flow straight to the bottom line. Basically, they were saying that this contract was terrible, and the CSC was very much overwhelmed, and CSC never disclosed any of this information to its investors, which is not the whole reason, but obviously half and half. You can't do this with the accounting, and then they don't disclose any of it, so they're violating GAAP both ways. The only disclosure that they made regarding this was in its 10K for 2009, and that the NHS contract was profitable, and that CSC was expected to recover all of the amount that it had invested up to that point in the contract, which was about $1 billion. And Michael Latham, the CEO, he even went further to tell investors during an earnings call that they had completed all the activities scheduled within the quarter, and obviously misleading investors because he knew that the profit was, by that time he knew the contract was unprofitable, and he knew that he'd been lying to investors when they said that they had been completing all these milestones. So they never accounted for the reduction in the contract value, and GAAP obviously requires the company to reflect the impact of that price decrease, value decrease of the contract with an inception to date adjustment. Okay, so apart from that, all those improper accounting and disclosures, to add to that, since they couldn't meet any of these things, they tried to re-enter negotiations to restructure the contract with NHS. They did this for months. I think it was almost over a year they were in contract negotiations. And NHS rejected all the offers, and the final one rejected an offer that would allow, obviously, CSC to retain its 16% profit margin. It seemed that management was pretty hell-bent on retaining that 16% profit margin to keep investors happy about the contract and make it appear that nothing was going wrong. But even though NHS rejected these terms, CSC adopted these proposed contract amendments and used it in their accounting model for the NHS contract. This is another clear violation of GAAP because the contract that they all signed and agreed upon was not the actual terms that they were trying to use for their model, which it doesn't really make sense to me how you would reason that. The only thing I can think of is they were so set on achieving that 16% profit margin. Okay, so this is another pretty shady thing that the management did. So Mancuso, the man I referred to earlier, he's a CFO. They were borrowing money from NHS at an extremely high interest rate. And the reason they were doing this was to meet their cash flow targets, because they weren't going to meet them otherwise. So they were borrowing hundreds of millions at over 6% interest, even though CSC could have went to a more traditional lender like a bank or creditor, and they could have borrowed that money at extremely lower rates. The advances peaked in 2010 at $580 million. So they were basically getting that each year, and attempting to repay back by the end of the year. I think they did it for 3 or 4 years, and one of the years they only paid back 22% of the original borrowing. So CSC recorded these cash flows as operating activities, so it would boost their year-end cash flows, which is an important metric for investors to make sure that they still have cash around the company. And these allowed the main part, the shady part about this is these advances allowed the senior executives to be paid large bonuses. So it was part of their annual incentives to reach these cash flow targets, and if they do, they obviously get these bonuses, which is the only reason why they were doing this. So here's a little picture of their stock. Their stock is doing pretty well, and I couldn't get the graph to get the industry index for this, but it was relatively the same all along here, and a little bit like before this it was about the same, and then 2011 hit, and CSC actually hired law firm, independent law firm, to look into stuff because they had been, I assume they were tipped off about something. So they hired them. They did an internal investigation, gave their rulings to the company and the SEC, and then the SEC announced its investigation around here. And you can see this just steady decline because the SEC investigation kept getting worse and worse. And then in 2012, it basically hit rock bottom. It was turned around. This is when new management came in. And you can see a little bit of an increase, came down, but they've been doing relatively well up until they merged. The new management really turned them around pretty well. This is the shareholder return average for CSC, and then the S&P 500 and the North American Technology Services Index. And you can see the CSC was doing pretty well in regards to everything until about 2010, early 2010 to 2011, kind of started dipping down a little bit, and then the news of the fraud broke, and it crashed because shareholders the value of the stock was dropping so drastically. So the settlement for CSC, they actually they settled to pay $190 million, but courts later reduced that to $100 million. Michael Laffin returned $3.7 million in compensation due to the Sarbanes-Oxley clawback provision, and he paid a $750,000 penalty. CFO Michael Mancuso returned almost $400,000 in clawbacks and paid a $175,000 penalty. The Robert Sutcliffe, he was actually just fired because of all this. Laffin retired or resigned, and then Mancuso retired. I couldn't find anything what they did after this, but I'm pretty sure Mancuso, he was actually pretty old. He's in his early 70s, so I think he actually just retired in general. But I couldn't find anything on Michael Laffin after this whole thing. So my key takeaways from this, actually they had a lot of trouble dealing with the British government because there was some political turmoil over this whole contract to begin with. They risked the involvement in political disputes, which is just one area which most companies probably wouldn't want to get entangled with. And then obviously disclosure is paramount to everything. Without disclosure, you won't be able to inform your investors and the general public of your changes in how you're doing business, your general accounting, and that'll leave them in the dark about how your business is actually doing financially, and how healthy your company is. That's it. Thank you.